So I want to welcome Brother Guy. I had the privilege of meeting him in person at the school that must not be named here in Berkeley, and it was just utter absolute, such a delight. Uh, and I'm looking forward to this talk immensely. One of the things in this whole process is that larger sense of wonderment, which should be the basis of everything we do, everything that we enjoy. There has to be that larger sense of a spirit of wonderment, which questions, which delights, which keeps on learning. And so, is signal if you haven't if you can't hear me. Right now, we're up to 46 participants. And I'm going to turn this over, to Michael Bronski, who is our ringleader here at Newman in terms of this whole process. Uh, Michael, would you want to say some introductory words first?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to give people a little bit of background on Brother Guy, very quick. So as I'm sure all of you know, Brother Guy is a renowned astronomer. We're very excited and privileged to have him come and talk to us today. He's also the Director Emeritus of the Vatican Observatory. He has published dozens of scientific papers and authored a number of books, including several that explore the relationship between science and faith. His research focuses on the links between asteroids and meteorites and how small bodies in the solar system form and evolve. Brother Guy received a PhD in planetary science from the University of Arizona, along with bachelor's and master's degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Prior to joining the Jesuit order, he served in the U.S. Peace Corps in Kenya and was an assistant professor of physics at Lafayette College. And whether Brother Guy is talking about science or faith, there's a joy and a warmth and a wisdom that flows through everything he has to say, and that makes him an absolute delight to listen to. I've personally enjoyed reading and listening to many of his works, and I think you're in for a real treat tonight. So with that, we'll turn it over to Brother Guy Consolmagno.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for having me here. Now, of course, I've got to live up to all of that. The talk I'm giving is called The Things They Ask the Pope's Astronomer. The three dots are to cover the fact that basically they're all crazy questions and questions without easy answers. But I'm going to try to answer them anyway. And the first one that people always ask is, why does the Pope have an astronomer? Why does the Vatican have an observatory? And there's a kind of a long history behind it. Going back to the reform of the calendar, the Gregorian calendar from Gregory the 13th was 1582. They hired a Jesuit, Christopher Clavius, to try to work out and to explain to people why the calendar was designed to work the way that it did. In fact, even before then, in the medieval universities, before there were Jesuits, astronomy was one of the topics that you were expected to study. And I'll get into a little more deeply the theological point behind why astronomy is interesting to study. What it doesn't have is directly, at least, that sense that, oh, God's up in the sky. That's not really why we're studying it, because we don't think God is up in the sky any more than he's anywhere else. The really interesting question is, why does the Vatican have an observatory today? We've figured out how to make the calendar work. We don't have to do that anymore. A lot of, let me get to, here we go. A lot of what goes on with there being a Vatican observatory is tied up in the history of the 1890s and why people thought the Vatican needed, why the Pope thought the Vatican needed an observatory then. A lot of it has to do with this book by Andrew Dixon White, the guy who founded Cornell. So if anybody's got any Cornell connections, I apologize. The title of the book was The History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. This idea that there is a war between science and theology dates from the end of the 19th century. It's an idea of the Victorian era. It is not something that was going on in the years before this. It isn't something that dates back to Galileo. Everything you know about Galileo is wrong. The truth doesn't make the church look any better. In the end of the 19th century, there are a couple of things going on. One was technology was growing so fast that people thought that you could replace religion with technology. Steam engines and electricity were going to save us all. And that belief carried on until, the 1930s when Germany gave us the world's most technologically advanced death camps. Technology by itself isn't going to do it. There was another thing going on at the same time, however. In 1891, when Pope Leo founds the observatory, he says so that everybody can see that the church is not opposed to science. But the other thing that he wanted the church, everybody to see, was that the Vatican, the Holy See, was a nation independent of Italy. In 1870, Garibaldi's armies had conquered Rome. The Pope was stuck with just the area around St. Peter's, and yet he was going to say, I'm not the subject of the King of Italy. I'm not the subject of the government of Italy. I'm still independent of them. And what are the signs of nationhood at the end of the 19th century? Among other things, you have your own stamps, you have your own coins, you have your own national observatory. And in fact, the Vatican was invited to take part as one of 18 national observatories in a project that would use this 1891 telescope to photograph the sky. Each of the 18 nations was given a different piece of the sky to photograph. Italy was given one piece, the Vatican was given a different piece. And out of this, a map of the sky was made. It was one of the very first international projects. Incidentally, it took them from 1891 until the 1950s to get most of the sky photographed. There's now a telescope in Chile, the Vera Rubin telescope, which will do the same thing to fainter stars 3 times a week. Technology has improved a bit. One of the things that technology does get you is city lights, which means that this telescope, which had been on the wall of St. Peter's, the wall of the Vatican, around the Vatican, was being surrounded by city lights. And even when they moved out to Castel Gandolfo, they still had the problem with light pollution there. And so in the 1990s, the director of the observatory in those days, George Coyne, had been at the University of Arizona. He'd been a teacher of mine when I was a student there. He did a deal with the University of Arizona to build a telescope in this area far from city lights. It's a beautiful telescope. There's a whole story behind the mirror and how it's made. And ask me questions about it. I could talk about the mirror for a while. It's a lovely telescope. Fabulous dark skies, steady skies, very good seeing, very good focusing. And it allows us to continue to do astronomical work. But the telescope is on a mountaintop 4 hours away from Tucson. Tucson, where I am now, is just one of the 2 places where the Vatican Observatory has its outfit. And we still have, back in Rome, a meteorite lab. This is the lab that I work in. And a great library and a great collection of historical photographic plates. And we even get visiting scientists show up, like this Argentinian chemist who was so excited to be there, he brought his own white lab coat. So there's the idea that the science that we do is, at the very basic level, to show the world that the church supports science. But clearly, there is more to it than that. And that really comes up in that second question. How do science and religion mix? Certainly for me, how do they mix? And it's a very short answer that religion tells me who made the universe, science tells me how he did it. They're answering different questions. Certainly well worth digging into more, but at this point, a little more of a fun question. What's it actually like to work at the Vatican? Now, there's this old joke that supposedly Pope John Paul the 23rd was asked how many people work at the Vatican, and he said, "Oh, about half of them." When I'm in Rome, we are actually not in the Vatican itself. We are at this place about an hour outside of Rome on the lip of a volcano. One of my fellow astronomers from America, who's well versed in the literatures, goes, "Yes, I've got a laboratory in a volcanic lair." He always wanted to be a mad scientist, but it's a beautiful spot. If you look at that little village of Castel Gandolfo, you will see at the very end a beautiful telescope dome of the church, which was actually designed by Bernini, and just behind it, the dome, not a telescope dome, a church dome. Behind it are the two telescope domes. From the village itself, you can see one of the telescope domes and one of the 1930s telescopes that's there. This is the Papal Palace. When I arrived there in 1993, that was the place where the Vatican also had its observatory. If you take a look at the windows there, the top window was where my office was located. I arrived there in 93, and until we moved in 2009, that was my office, and it was just above the Pope's bedroom. So yeah, you're looking at the one guy in the Catholic Church who used to be above the Pope. You can also see that that building has got this, open square, very typical Italian. And if you look inside, that's where my bedroom was. When the Pope would be in residence during the summertime, this is especially during the years of John Paul II. John Paul II was a marvelous Pope, but he was elected at a relatively young age. He was in his 50s, and he made a rookie mistake. Somebody from Poland asked him, "What's your favorite hymn?" And he gave them the name of a hymn. Well, every Sunday at noon, when the Pope was in residence, he would speak to the crowd that would come inside that gate yard where the little arrow is. They would let people in at 10 o'clock. They'd be waiting there for 2 hours for the Pope to show up. Most of them are Polish, pilgrims. What are they going to do? Sing that favorite hymn of the Pope. My bedroom overlooked that square. I had to hear that hymn every Sunday for 2 hours from 10 until noon. Now, it's possible that some of you people may not have been aware that the Pope had an observatory. If that's the case, that's your problem because it's in all of the great literature, starting with the Da Vinci Code. Yes, indeed. I actually haven't read the entire code, so I don't know if these are the good people or the bad people. But one of the bits I love is the section here where Aaron Garosa, apparently he's one of the good guys or the bad guys. I think he's a bad guy. He's driven out to Castel Gandolfo. A young Jesuit priest greets him, "I'm Father Mangano, an astronomer." Good for you. Well, maybe that was, a takeoff on my name, Consolmagno. Who knows? Then the author of the Da Vinci Code describes the Vatican Observatory. A wide open space whose decor was a graceless blend of Renaissance art and astronomy. Well, this is actually what it looks like. Not Renaissance art, not astronomy images, dates from the 1590s, but I wouldn't call that graceless. Following his escort up a wide travertine marble staircase, travertine is marble, but never mind. Aaron Garosa saw signs for conference centers, lecture halls, tourist information. Actually, if you go up those stairs, they're made out of brick. They're not marble. And they're slanted because this was originally where donkeys would carry heavy things up to the top floor, because this was, before the days of electric elevators. This was the 1590s. At the top was a wide, lushly appointed corridor to a huge set of oaken doors announcing, well, that's actually the doors to the library. The famous astronomy library, 25,000 volumes. We actually have more than that. Rare books of Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler and Newton and Secchi? Who's Secchi? Secchi actually turns out to be a really important Italian astronomer. But I'm sure the guy who wrote the Da Vinci Code has no knowledge of that. He was just pulling names off the internet like everything else. So, where is this marvelous place where the popes hide out? That's actually what it looks like. Very functional library, and that was the library up until 2009. In 2009, the Pope, at this point, Pope Benedict, had realized that he was no longer going to the summer palace just to, kick back during the summertime. He's actually using the place on a regular basis. And he decided that the observatory should move from the palace, which is in the red circle, to down to the left, at one end of the gardens, 2 kilometers away, to a building, a new building, much newer building, 1630 rather than 1590. And this is the place where we are located today. What they did was to completely remodel the inside. I mean, they took jackhammers to the floors and lowered them. And I tell you, living in a palace sounds great until you realize it was built before central heating or plumbing or the internet. This place has been completely rebuilt. Every room's got its own shower. Every room has the same kind of electrical outlet from room to room to room. If you've ever lived in Italy, you realize that's unheard of. We spent one night in the new quarters and said, we're never going back. So we have a beautiful location there where we hold summer schools, where we hold conferences, where we do the research. I mean, you spend 1 week at the telescope, and then you've got 6 months of reducing the data, trying to figure out what it means, and planning out what you're going to do the next time you get to the telescope. You're not at the telescope during that time. You're in this incredibly beautiful building in the gardens, along the volcanic lip, with a wonderful Italian town just out your front door, all that great Italian food. Life is tough. They ordered me to go there under obedience. One of the real questions that I think is a great way that the Vatican Observatory can help people understand why we do science and how science and religion blend together is in the answer to this question. Why do we need the Big Bang Theory? Doesn't Genesis tell us that God made everything? No. Genesis tells us that God made everything. The Big Bang tells us how he did it. At least our best theory as of right now. For one thing, the author of the Big Bang Theory was this guy with the familiar Roman collar there. That's Father Georges Lemaitre. Father Lemaitre was a mathematician with a doctorate from Louvain and another doctorate from MIT. And he's working here with Arthur Eddington, the guy with the hat and the pipe, an English scientist whose observations first indicated that the general theory of relativity probably was right, or at least was better than what had come along before. Lemaitre was the kind of a guy who could read mathematical equations the way that you might be able to read poetry. And looking at the equations of general relativity and knowing that people had seen that galaxies appeared to have their spectral lines shifted to the red, saying that they were moving away from us. In the 1920s, he wrote a paper suggesting that the universe itself was expanding, that if you look carefully, you would see that the farther the galaxy was from us, the faster it was expanding. He predicted this a year before Hubble discovered it. It's now called the Lemaitre-Hubble law. And he then said, if this is true, this is an entire cosmology that we can run the clock backwards. and ask ourselves, if that's what the case is now, what was the universe like when it hadn't expanded so much? The same amount of energy in a smaller space means essentially a higher temperature until you get to the entire universe being at a point that he would call the cosmic seed or the cosmic egg. And that date was, as he referred to it, a day without yesterday. When he proposed this in the 1920s and 30s, he actually got a lot of pushback, not from the religious people. Religious people. Pope Pius XII said, "Hey, he's talking about the universe having a beginning. I could have told him that." More about that later. Instead, the people who are furious about this were the non-believing of those days scientists. In particular, Fred Hoyle, who appeared on the BBC radio, talking about his theory for how the universe, evolved and moves, made fun of Lemaitre's theory by referring to it as that Big Bang theory. Those scientists hated the Big Bang because it implied a universe with a beginning, a universe with a singular event happening at some time, which we can now, from the motions of the universe, actually calculate back at 13.7 billion years ago. And that violated their belief that the universe was always there. It violated their idea that the universe somehow made itself. But baked into that fear of the universe that made itself was a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to create and what the Big Bang actually is. Let's assume the Big Bang is right. It's the best theory we've got. It survived for about 100 years. And we're refining it. We're always, tweaking this bit and that bit. But that's the general framework, seems to hold up. Just because it's been around for 100 years doesn't mean anything. Aristotle was around for 1,500 years, turned out to be wrong. But let's just assume that. Does this mean, is this a proof that there has to be a God who created things? Is this a threat to the idea of God creating things if the universe could create itself? Somebody who was, really, really tough on this was Stephen Hawking. And with a buddy of his, Leonard Latimer, he wrote a book in about 2012 where he says, I've discovered why we don't need God to create the Big Bang. Thank heavens, it's safe for me to be an atheist. And his idea is this. Space-time is what we call the general relativity sense of the fabric of the universe. But nothing in the universe is perfectly uniform. At the level of quantum physics, there will be tiny fluctuations. Now, part of general relativity was to say that a bending of space-time is what we call gravity. And in this book, he comes up with the marvelous line, because there is a thing called gravity, I can explain how the universe creates itself. And here's how it works. That third level there with all the little peaks and valleys. Quantum uncertainty means at any kind of place, because you can't exactly say a real place, in space-time, there will be a tiny fluctuation. And if you wait long enough, one of these fluctuations are going to be bigger than another. And if you wait really long, and we got all the time in the universe, literally, one such fluctuation might grow to the point where it actually bursts into the expansion of the universe. All happening by random chance in the space-time universe. And therefore, Hawking says, because there is this gravity and these gravity fluctuations, the universe makes itself and I don't need God. What do you say to that, Mr. Jesuit astronomer? Well, here's a couple of problems. Number one, where did the space-time continuum come from in the first place? Why is there space? Why is there time? Why are there the laws of physics that say at the quantum, well, the universe couldn't exist without them, but why does the universe exist? The creation of the universe is the creation of space and time and its laws. The Big Bang is not the creation of the universe. The Big Bang is what happens after the universe is created, immediately after the universe is created. There's another problem, another theological problem. The God who does nothing but create the universe, the prime mover, the little fuse that's set off to make the universe bang. That's not the God of Scripture. That's not the God of love. That's just a force alongside electricity and magnetism, and Hawking may well be right that that's what happened. But notice, if Hawking were right, then he has defined God as the thing that started the universe. And then he says gravity is the thing that started the universe. He's not saying that there is no God. He's saying that gravity is God. His definition of God is way too narrow compared to the God of Scripture, the God of religion. Of course, if God were gravity, that would explain why Catholics celebrate Mass. I don't hear the groans. There should be earth-shattering groans at this point. I see a few people, crying. Let's go back to that actual Genesis version. The universe, as described in the first book of Genesis, is this flat world with a dome and water above and below the dome. And this is the universe that you actually see if you walk outside at night. The stars do look like they're in a dome overhead. Maybe more than one dome carrying the sun, and another dome carrying the moon, and another dome carrying each of the different other planets, 7 of them all together. What else comes in sevens? No, deadly sins, but what about the days of the week? In many Renaissance Romance languages like Italian, the days of the week are connected to the names of the planets. That's why we have 7 days in a week, because there are 7 things that can be seen to move in the sky. We still do that in English. We've got Sunday and Moon Day and Saturn Day. And the English names for the other planets are just the Norse versions of the gods that you see in French or Italian. Lunardi is Monday. Martedi, Mars Day, that's Tuesday. Toys Day, the god Toy. Woden's Day, well, that would be Mercury Day, Mercolidi. Thor's Day, well, that's Jupiter's Day, Jovidi. Venus's Day, Venerdi, is the same as Frida's Day, Friday. We have been using the motions of the things we see in the sky as a way of doing timekeeping, going back not just to the calendar of Pope Gregory, going back to before written history. Today's Monday. 7 days ago was Monday. 7 days before then was Monday. Even through the reform of the calendar in 1582, they kept that cadence of 7 days earlier would be Monday. And that cadence continues to before written history. At least, in the Babylonians, where it first came from. This cosmology, that is the cosmology described in the opening chapter of Genesis, is not original to Genesis. This is, in fact, Babylonian cosmology. And we know that the Hebrews who wrote the book of Genesis were writing at a time when they were in very close contact with Babylon. In fact, they were probably the Jews of the Babylonian captivity, the ones who had been carried off by the Babylonians around 600 BC to help run the bureaucracy because they could read and write. And one of the ways we know that is we've got the Babylonian myth. And the Babylonian myth says that there was a god, Marduk, and a dragon named Tiamat who was creating chaos everywhere. And that word Tiamat is actually the root of the Hebrew word for chaos in the opening of Genesis chapter 1. What's interesting is not that the people from who are writing Genesis 1 stole this stuff. They weren't stealing it. They were just describing the best science of the day. What's interesting in Genesis is not the cosmology, which was going to be obsolete within 100 years as the Greeks finally realized the world was round and it wasn't covered with domes, but covered with shells. What's interesting are the ways that the Jewish story, that the story of Genesis 1 is different. And it's different in the way that it describes how it was created. In the Babylonian story, creation occurs by accident. We happen to be inside the dome of the belly of the dragon Tiamat, because there are all these gods fighting each other and then fighting a dragon. Human beings are made by accident, but they manage to huddle inside the dragon and get together and cleverly come to the climax of the creation story for the Babylonians, which was making the city of Babylon. The most wonderful thing you could possibly imagine. In the Genesis story, things are turned on their head. In the beginning, there is a beginning. In the beginning, God, wait a minute, God's already there in the beginning. And there's only one God there in the beginning. But this God who's there in the beginning is there before there is creation happening. That means that God is not part of the universe. God is not part of nature. God is not one force in nature alongside gravity and electromagnetism. God is supernatural. And this is what the word supernatural actually means. It means a God who is outside of nature. Supernatural is not the same thing as Casper the Friendly Ghost. Because Casper the Friendly Ghost, if there was such a thing, would just be, something we hadn't figured out in nature yet. This God is outside of nature, outside of space and outside of time. And so when creation occurs, all of time is created, all of space is created. Creation is not the result of a chaos, but it is as orderly as day follows night, like each of these windows in showing, creation, starting with, imagery from the Hubble. And creation occurs because God makes it happen through a word. It's a deliberate action of the Creator God. What's the first thing that is created? Light. And I'm not talking about the sun and the moon. That's not till the fourth day. The fact that light is made before anything else means that everything that's done is done in the open, so it can be seen, so it can be understood. Light makes life possible. It makes encounter possible. It makes communication possible. That's not me saying this. That's a quotation from Pope Benedict, who, said this in an Easter Sunday, Saturday night mass in 2014, I think it was, 2012. 2012. He also points out, incidentally, that we human beings want to make our own lights that blind us to God's lights. That's what I call light pollution. He says that's what sinfulness is. I think, yeah, well, light pollution is a sin. I could tell you that. What's another thing that we learn in the story of creation? That every step along the way, God looks at it and said, this is good. Which is just another way of saying, yeah, that works. Yeah, I like this. Notice all of these differences, all of these important things that God outside of nature creates it, does it deliberately, does it in the open, does it logically, says it is good. All of these are necessary for science to actually be possible. If we believed in a universe where all the important stuff was hidden and we'd never find out, then what would be the point of doing the science? If we believed in a universe that didn't follow laws as logical as day and night, but rather was the chaotic action of some god of lightning, I could never know when the lightning's going to strike again, because who knows what Zeus is going to do. But if you say there is no Zeus, then you're opening up the question, well, then where did the lightning come from? Oh, I'm going to have to think a little bit more. And maybe I can come to a logical description of where lightning comes from. All of these points are points that are essential for us to be able to do science. Genesis is not a replacement for science. Genesis is the foundation. I don't care what kind of cosmology. If you look in the rest of Scripture, the Old Testament, New Testament, there's half a dozen different places where the creation of the world is described in shorthand or longhand. Genesis 2 is very different from Genesis 1. It doesn't matter what you think the scientific description is, because that keeps changing. And it better keep changing, or else I'm not doing my job. Regardless of what the description of how the events that occur when the universe evolves, the underlying message of Genesis 1 remains the same, that it's the deliberate act of a God working alone, working in the light, doing things because it's good. Genesis supports science. But there's one last wonderful thing about the creation story of Genesis 1 that the Babylonians don't have. What was the climax of the Babylonian story? The climax of the Babylonian story was the city of Babylon. What's the climax of the creation story in Genesis? What is it all leading up to? What is the last, most wonderful, most amazing thing, unthinkable thing that God creates? No, it's not human beings. That's the sixth day. It's the weekend. It's the Sabbath. It's the day of rest. And this day of rest is more than just, oh my gosh, I've got to take a break, though there's nothing wrong with that. The day of rest is the day when we can spend our time doing things that don't necessarily put food in our stomachs, doing things that don't necessarily put clothing on our back, doing things that feed our souls, looking at the stars and wondering, what am I looking at? Making pictures of them, telling stories about them, making poetry, doing dance, all of the things that, a cat wouldn't do, like a cow wouldn't do, but human beings do. The things that give us our souls, that feed our souls. That is the last and ultimate gift. So that to look at the stars and wonder about them is fulfilling a command to keep the Sabbath holy. One question we always get, which I think ties into this, would you baptize an extraterrestrial? I wrote a book about this. And the great thing about the book is that it makes you ask, what does baptism mean? What is baptism all about? And how do you know if an alien can receive baptism? The theology of the soul says the soul has intellect and free will. Free will that I can choose to look at the stars. Intellect that I can wonder about them. And in that wondering, come up with beautiful poetic ways to describe what I see, whether it's poetry in the words or poetry in the equations, which are just another language to express our human imagination. Any creature that is aware that it exists and is wondering if a God exists and is free to choose whether or not to love that God, they're not alien. They're us. They're our cousins. Those are some of the questions I get asked at the Vatican Observatory. We claim that we're faith-inspiring science. If you want to know more about us, you can go to our website or actually, put your phone up to there and use the QR code. And at that, I'll happily take questions.
Thanks so much, Brother Guy. Michael here for that, outstanding talk. Before we move to Q&A, I just want to briefly help the audience find some of your work. So I'm just going to screen share here real quickly.
Okay.
Hopefully that works us up.
Right.
And I should say for the audience too, there's a handout in the lobby at Newman with all this information. So there's no need to try to write everything down.
Here's the thing to do. You go to Barnes & Noble, you go to your local bookstore, you go to Amazon. Any book that has the name Consolmagno, buy 3 or 4 copies. That's really all you have to do.
All right, so we're done and on to Q&A now. So as I mentioned earlier, Brother Guy has offered several books, that explore the relationship between science and faith. I'd like to recommend 2 of them that you might find especially helpful. And Brother Guy just mentioned, would you baptize an extraterrestrial? And other questions from the astronomers inbox at the Vatican Observatory, co-authored with Father Paul Muller, an absolutely delightful book. The first chapter alone is worth the price of admission, which you can't say about too many books. Another excellent one from Brother Guy is God's Mechanics, How Scientists and Engineers Make Sense of Religion. Now, if you'd like to start with something, a bit shorter, just to get warmed up, you can easily find a wide range of interviews, profiles, and talks online. Last year, Rebecca Mead wrote a great profile of Brother Guy in the Vatican Observatory for The New Yorker. I also really like this old interview from Alyssa Poe with Brother Guy from 2008. The original website was taken down, but if you Google Alyssa Poe and Guy Consolmagno, you can easily find a version that Ms. Poe archived on her personal website. It should be the first result, and this is also available on the Internet Archive if you're adept at navigating that. And finally, there was an interview with the editors of the U.S. Catholic that I also really enjoy as well. So those could be great starting points for you. And now with that, then I think we're ready for Q&A. And there is, a Q&A box. You can, I believe, even submit questions anonymously. But if you look on the bottom toolbar, there should be, a Q&A, and you can click that, and you can put your questions there. Hopefully, people can do that. If you're having problems, maybe people can raise their hands. I see, Adam raised his hand. But maybe I'll just give you a second to start to put some questions in the Q&A box. And in the meantime, I guess I'll get us started with a quick question while we wait for more questions to pour in. So Brother Guy, I know from, listening to some of your other interviews, reading your books, you've often quoted Romans, chapter 1, verse 20, God is revealed in the things he has made. Have you ever learned something about the natural world that was difficult to reconcile with other things that you knew to be true about God? And if so, how
No,
did you navigate that juncture?
that never happened because they're not on the same, one is on a meta level compared to the other. They're not talking exactly about the same things. Religion is what gives me the courage to do the science. And if my religion is telling me something that the science contradicts, then it's probably talking about, either an issue that science has no reason to talk about, or that religion has no reason to talk about. But there's something even deeper. This bit of science isn't of the same order as this bit of religion. They're not really talking about the same thing, so I shouldn't worry about one contradicting. But more than that, what has happened is this bit of science contradicts this other bit of science. And when that happens, you get really excited. You go, oh my gosh, I'm going to get a paper out of this. Because I've discovered that the science that I thought I knew was incomplete. This science that I thought I knew maybe is not as true as I thought. You only learn when you realize that you need to learn. You only learn when you're willing to say, oops, I thought I knew, but my knowledge was incomplete. And that better be the way we are with God as well. That better be the way we are with religion. Science is not a big book of facts. Religion is not a big book of facts or big book of rules. That's the way we teach it, to high school kids. But we're not in high school anymore. We've learned that science is all the stuff we don't know. Religion is this relationship of love with God. And if you've had any experience with love, you know that love is not a puzzle that you solve and say, yep, got that one figured out. Don't have to worry about her anymore. No. If you love that other person, you're going to be constantly surprised and intrigued and brought up short, and they will be with you as well. Because that's what love is, this continual discovery of a universe of a person that goes on and certainly the universe of God goes on forever. Just as science never comes to an end. We never have, written the book in Newtonian physics. We've written the book because we know it's wrong, because we know it's incomplete, and we know the boundaries of where it doesn't work. A science that is complete is a science that's dead. A love that's complete is a love that's dead.
Well, thank you very much for that. Okay, so Felicia would like to know, does the Catholic Church have a position on the existence of aliens?
Nope. God can do whatever God wants. I'm not going to tell him what to do and what not to do. But I'll tell you that the church is not afraid of aliens. And you can see this in our traditions. We have in our religion this whole tradition of angels. Angels are not human beings. Angels, nonetheless, are in a relationship with God. We are not afraid of there being creatures in a relationship with God who are fundamentally different from us. Now, is an angel an actual description of an entity? Is it a symbolic description of things that we don't have words for? Maybe both are true at the same time. I'm not going to argue with how many wings an angel has. But I am going to say that as messengers from God, we experience moments where, oh my gosh, God was talking to me. I wasn't even asking. This is part of, Jesuit spirituality. This happens. Sometimes prayers are answered even before you pray. That sense of something in the universe more than what I can describe or measure with the ruler. I can't describe beauty without, with a ruler. I can't describe truth without a ruler, with a ruler. And therefore, I'm not afraid of a universe filled not necessarily only in space, but also in time, the 13 billion years in the past, the 100 billion years or more that we're going to have in the future. But I do know that if they are created by God, then they're not all that alien. On the other hand, maybe we are the only ones that God created. Scary thought, but we don't know any different. And will it change the way we live if we believe the one or the other? If you're expecting the aliens to do all the heavy lifting and tell us how to live, oh, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. But if you're saying the universe is filled with marvelous people, it doesn't matter how many tentacles they have, it doesn't matter what kind of atmosphere they breathe. We've got friends that we can make. That's a wonderful thought, too.
Thank you for that. We have another attendee who asked, can you speak about the star that guided the Magi?
It's a chapter in the book.
There you go.
Which is to say, actually, no, I can't. I wasn't there. I didn't have a video camera. I wasn't able to interview Matthew, who wrote about it in only 11 verses. But I can say this. Examine what is it that makes the Star of Bethlehem so fascinating that, every Christmas I get a dozen people who have written an article or put together a YouTube. Please, no more YouTubes. Why is it that this is so fascinating? Rather than just dismissing it, it doesn't really, it does matter. If it matters because you think if I can show it's scientific, then I've proved the Bible is true. Well, I believe the Bible is true whether or not the star is scientific. If you're saying, oh, I can prove the star is scientific and therefore there are no miracles, that's also, a bad understanding of what a miracle is. Miracles don't have to be a violation of the laws of physics. They're merely an unusual thing that brings us to God. Because what really is important isn't the star, it's the baby that the star is supposed to be leading us to. Now, there are lots of theories of what it might be. I've got some favorites, but I sure don't know what it is. I do love the fact that these 11 verses that are pretty vague in the book, in Matthew's gospel, have inspired so many people to think about the universe and the star and the stars and the second person of the Trinity of God who chose to become part of all of this. As physical, as easier to touch than the stars. The baby's easier to get to than the star. And there's the miracle.
All right. Gregory would like to know, what role does apologetics play in your understanding of finding God in science?
Not that much of a role. I was cursed with much too happy a childhood. I was never beset by terrible doubts. The idea of God as Father was easy because my father I thought was a wonderful man. And so I could understand God as being a wonderful father-like character. There's a great book that I would recommend if people are turned off by apologetics. It's by a fellow named Francis Spufford, and it's called Unapologetic. And he points out that our belief has to be more than simply carefully reasoned, but then that's the way that science works. I see something, and in my gut, in my hunch, I say, I'll bet you this is what's going on. And once I've got that, I betcha, then I'll spend 2 years working out the logic to see if it actually works, to see if I can show somebody else what I think is going on. But it starts with that gut feeling. It starts with that intuition. It starts with something more than reason. Reason is what we use to flesh out the intuition. Apologetics only works if we've already got a reason to kind of suspect that maybe this might be true.
All right. So for our next question, we have Victor, who would like you to know that he's actually originally from Kenya. And he has a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
Are there observations that the public has never heard about? And if yes, why keep them quiet? How do you
There
decide
aren't.
what gets shared publicly and what stays internal?
Everything gets shared. For one thing, astronomers are terrible at keeping secrets. Sometimes there will be a result from a big space telescope that looks really important, and a lot of people were involved in it. There may be 500 people who are authors of the paper, and they say, don't tell anybody until we've checked it out, that we've had the referees look at it, that we've had the editors go over the paper, and only after a certain date can you talk about it in public. But everybody knows about it because you can't help but talk about it. It's, well, it's like falling in love. When you fall in love, it's really hard to hide it. Everybody. So you fall in love with this idea, you fall in love with this new discovery. That's one of the reasons that, I am not a conspiracy believer because I know my astronomer friends. They couldn't make a conspiracy work to save their lives. They couldn't keep a secret to save their lives over and over and over again. Things that people have said, just hold off, don't mention it for another, 5 days. It gets out. It always gets out.
All right, we have a little softball question here to break things up a little bit. Felicia wants some Vatican Observatory merch. Where can she get some?
If you go to the VaticanObservatory.org website, all one word spelled out, VaticanObservatory.org, there's a place where you can get shirts like this. And it's one of those, they make them on demand. And the profits, which are not very great, wound up going to the foundation that supports the telescope and supports the work of the observatory in the U.S.
All right, another attendee asked, do you ever get extremely frustrated with scientists saying that it's impossible that there is a creator? I ascribe this to their overinflated sense of intellectual superiority. They can't conceive that there is something beyond their realm to reason. Please help me have more charity towards them.
Well, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, when I became a Jesuit, I'd been a scientist for 20 years at that point. And I'm wondering, what are my friends going to think? I've come out of the closet as a churchgoer. And the crazy thing was, over and over and over again, people came up to me and said, you go to church? Like, sure couldn't tell. And then they'd say, let me tell you about the church I go to. And I go, you go to church too? Certainly among the astronomers, there are very few who would say they're atheists. Even the ones you think might be, Carl Sagan was this famous 40 years ago popularizer who was adamant about not being a believer. And yet, when somebody said, are you an atheist? He said, no. An atheist is somebody who knows more than I do. Because they're ready to recognize they don't know it all. The only people that you find who are evangelical public atheists, there are very few among them, are the ones who are doing it to try to sell themselves. Look at me, I'm smarter than all those other people. That's a very sadly common trait, not among scientists, not among engineers only, among all of us. The people who get on the internet to find the secret knowledge, the people who will read these badly written books to find out, I know something that the other. Hey, you remember Genesis chapter 2, Genesis chapter 3, the story of the snake in the garden? That's the same BS that he was selling you. Secret knowledge. They don't want you to know, but there isn't secret knowledge. And that desire to be one up on everybody else that was the original sin. So that, in fact, the idea that scientists are atheists is a false idea sold to you by the people who are on TV because they're trying to sell you that they're smarter than everybody else. Stephen Hawking, you read Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, and you realize the most important message that he wants to tell you is, I'm smarter than you are. And he actually isn't. The idea that I don't know for sure, they're calling that agnosticism. I'm calling that faith. Of course, I don't know for sure. That's why I need faith. Of course, I'm not sure that, the woman I'm going to marry won't cheat on me in 20 years' time. How can I know that now? And yet I'll still decide to marry her, or not in my case. How do I know that I went to the right school? How do I know that I've chosen the right career or that this is the right apartment to move into? You don't know ahead of time. You make the best judgment you can based on inadequate data. And in some cases, you may have to decide, I guess I got it wrong. And this is good because getting it wrong is how you learn. That's how science works. Constantly discovering that what you thought you knew was incomplete and therefore not entirely right. There's nothing wrong with that. But to demand certainty is the death of faith. There's a religious writer, Anne Lamott, who has this marvelous phrase: the opposite of faith isn't doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty.
Okay. Adam asked that he read that Father Lemaitre was dismayed by Pope Pius XII's initial description of the Big Bang theory. What was this debate about, and how does the Church view concordism today?
Ah, great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Because this was the story I promised to tell and it never got to the end of it. If you look carefully at what Pius XII said, he comes right up to the edge without actually dumping into concordism. The concordism, the idea that, the Big Bang says the universe began with "let there be light," and the Big Bang is this burst of energy, which is light. So Genesis said, "Let there be light," and the Big Bang says there's light. They must have. No, that's not how you read Scripture. Misreads Scripture. It imposes your 2026 understanding of the universe onto poetry that has been timeless for 2,500 years. The science that you're trying to impose on it is going to be obsolete in 100 years' time. I hope, if I've done my job right. But the truth of Scripture doesn't go obsolete, so they cannot be of the same thing, and you cannot do a one-to-one map of the one onto the other. What really happened with the Lemaitre and Pius XII, after Pius XII made this statement, look at that, the scientists say there's a beginning, we could have told them that. Lemaitre went to the Pope, had an audience with him. We know this because we've heard the story from Ernest McMullen, who was Lemaitre's postdoc. And Ernest McMullen was a theologian and physicist at Notre Dame. He tells the story. The story goes that Lemaitre says, please, Your Holiness, don't do that. Don't use my theory as, something to base your faith on, because my theory could be wrong. My theory eventually is going to be shown to be incomplete. And remember, creation occurs outside of space and time. The creation of "let there be light" is true not only 13 billion years ago, it's true now, in this place, in this time, which is what Thomas Aquinas is saying when he says that the creation of the universe is God maintaining the universe constantly in every, because it's done outside of space and time, and therefore it applies to every space and time. And the Pope understood that and never said that again. He praised astronomy when he talked to the International Astronomical Union meeting in Rome in 1952, and he praised the greats of astronomy, including Galileo and Kepler and Newton. But he never again made the mistake of saying, "Oh, this bit of science supports what we believed in faith."
Sydney asks, what do you think about the proposed idea of humans potentially colonizing Mars? Is it a sort of abandonment of the home, i.e., Earth, that God made for us?
That's a really loaded word, colonize, because it's got a bad history. And yet, I kind of like using it if it reminds us that we can do it the wrong way, imposing ourselves on another planet. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. The problems of getting human beings through the cosmic ray environment from Earth to Mars and being able to survive. We can't even get, a pound of rocks off of Mars right now. We're not going to get a human being off of Mars and back to Earth anytime soon. But that's anytime soon. 1,000 years from now? Will we want to? I hope so. Because that curiosity of seeing what's on the other side of the hill, not only is it feeding in something fundamental to who we are as human beings, feeding our souls, doing something of the Sabbath part of our lives, but the more we learn about the universe, the more we are amazed at the God who created it. The bigger we see the universe, the bigger we make our understanding of how big God is.
Sterling asks, are you a fan of science fiction? If so, have you read or have an opinion of Mary Doria Russell's The Sparrow or the new film, The Hail Mary Project?
I am a big science fiction fan. Went to MIT because it had a big science fiction library. My best friend was going there, and I saw the science fiction books and said, I got to read them. That said, I've got strong opinions, and everybody's got strong opinions. Back when I worked in the science fiction library, and people would say, oh, can you recommend a book? I'd say, well, name one you liked. And if it was a book I liked, I'd recommend another book I liked. And if it was a book I hated, I'd recommend another book that I hated. Because that's the fun of it. We can have different opinions. I don't like The Sparrow. And the reason I don't like it is that she took the entire situation much too seriously. The Jesuits in that book had no sense of humor. Any Jesuit I knew who was in the situation of the Jesuits in the book, and I won't go into the details, I mean, they would have been laughing themselves silly because it was so ridiculous. There are a couple of other things that I think she, technically got wrong, but um, I confess I was not a huge fan of The Martian, and I've tried reading the Hail Mary Project. I have an audiobook version of it, and it puts me to sleep, which it's not a fault of the book. It's who I am. It's scratching an itch that I don't have. There are books that I do, like authors I really enjoy. Connie Willis, I enjoy her stuff immensely. An old-time science fiction writer, James Schmitz, writes terrible space opera, and I find it incredibly delightful. So science fiction can approach really deep issues, but I'm a Jesuit. I do deep issues as a living. I'm looking for popcorn sometimes, and I enjoy the science fiction that's more popcorn. But everybody is free to have their own opinion. A lot of people really like The Sparrow. A lot of people have really enjoyed seeing the Hail Mary Project. I'm not going to tell them they're wrong.
George asks, what to make of the astronomical references in the Bible, both Old and New Testament? For example, in Ezekiel, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God, and the Magi star in the east.
What is the author trying to convey? The author is certainly not giving us a treatise about the stars, just any more than, that's what was important to the people writing about the Magi. The author is telling you that the salvation of the world comes to us in the physical world. That we are human beings made of atoms living in space and time because that's how the God who created us. And this is the theater where we get to encounter God. The physical universe matters. There's a marvelous phrase by an Anglican priest and physicist, John Polkinghorne, who says, we are not apprentice angels. In other words, we don't have the soul trapped in these stupid, aging, turning gray meat puppet bodies trying to get out. No, we are the flesh and blood. This body is so important that Jesus doesn't talk about life, life after death. Jesus talks about eternal life. That in some way, the resurrection that we celebrated yesterday means that the physical body was so important that Jesus did not abandon it, even when it was scarred with wounds in the hands and the side. That's what the references to the astronomy, to the botany, to the physical, also realizing that, remember that Ezekiel does not find God in the lightning or the thunder or the earthquake, but in the still small voice. And yet it's a voice that in some way we can hear.
I know we've run over a little bit, Brother Guy. If you have time, we have one more question, if
Okay.
that's okay. I think it's a good one. Um, so, oh, hold on, a bunch more just dropped in. Asa asked, can you say more about your path to the Vatican? Was your path there linear? Was this always a goal of yours? Or if not, when did it become one?
It never was a goal. I thought about being a priest when I was 18, and I realized mostly I wanted to be a priest to get out of the freshman dorms because everybody else was a big, drinker, and I couldn't stand the smell of alcohol. And I thought they were a bunch of idiots. And I realized getting out of the freshman dorm was not a good reason to be a priest. What am I going to do as a priest? I'm going to be listening to these idiots when they come with me with their problems, and I'm not the one to do that. Uh, So I, went to MIT instead. I figured if I was already prepared for a life of celibacy, then going to a nerd school would be just right for me. Um, and, for the next 20 years, I looked for a career in science. I was hoping I'd find a wife and a family and settle down, maybe in Boston. I thought Boston would be a great place to be a professor somewhere. And when I hit 30, I was wondering, none of that was happening. I was dating people and it just didn't work. And I wasn't getting a job. I was a postdoc at MIT, but I couldn't get that next step. And I'm thinking, why am I doing astronomy when people were starving? Which is why I went to Kenya. And the Kenyans taught me, oh, we're doing it because we want to know about the science too. We want to do it just like anybody else, come on. Oh, that's right. Studying the universe is what makes us more than just a well-fed cow. That's why we do it. I went back to teaching at Lafayette College and I enjoyed teaching so much that I thought, too bad I wasn't a Jesuit. I could have been in a Jesuit school. Well, suddenly it occurred to me Jesuits have brothers. Brothers get to live in the same community, but we're not priests. I'm not expected to, listen to people's confessions because I wouldn't have the slightest idea what to tell them. I entered the Jesuits thinking that I was going to be teaching at a place like USF or Loyola Marymount or Georgetown or Boston College. But, three vows, even if you're a brother. Vow of poverty, well, I'd been a grad student. I was used to that. Vow of chastity, well, I'd been a grad student. I was used to that. The vow of obedience, that was what I was not used to. I can no longer say, I'm going to take this job and screw that one. I have agreed to go where my Jesuit superiors say I'm needed. And they said I'm needed in Rome to be a full-time astronomer. I'd done that. I thought I was, burned out on that. I wanted to teach. But they said, no, you're going to be a full-time astronomer. It felt wonderful doing something that I didn't want to do as a way of saying, I'm doing this for you, God. And then, of course, that's all ruined by the fact that I'm having the time of my life, which I didn't expect at all. But I get to do the science I want. If it takes 10 years to make the measurements of the meteorites before I have a full data set, I'm not worried about my grant running out after 3 years. It has been an ideal life to be a scientist, and it's been an enormous amount of fun, more than I ever would have known or ever could have planned. So, no, it wasn't a straight line. It wasn't even my idea. It wasn't what I thought I wanted, but it was a delight to obey.
All right, we have a few more questions, but want to be very respectful for your time and not push you too far over. So I think we can call it there. And thank you again,
And
brother.
they should just, buy all of my books several times over, and everything will be answered there. Don't I wish?
And
Don't I wish?
They'll actually come pretty close. I've read a lot. They'll come close.
let me add something to that too. I'm on the other side. I love the Genesis story, and I hate the literalism that destroys what is an extremely sophisticated text. And I do this little number with it, and we compare it with the Enuma Elish, the Babylon creation story. Lots of fun. And so any of you, of all 50 of you, were interested in hearing about that, you can always make an appointment. Gladly open up the scriptures and have some fun with it. And let's redeem the scriptures from some bad treatment of literalists, okay?
Absolutely. The trouble with fundamentalism isn't that it's bad science, is that it's bad religion.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much, brothers. Good seeing you again.
Right? It was great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for arranging all this. Really so appreciate it. The energy of it all is just wonderful.
Well, again, thank you very much, Brother Guy. Outstanding talk.
Thanks a bunch, and thanks for having me, everybody. Take
And
care.
thank you for everybody for listening as well. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Have a wonderful Easter season.